You can sit anywhere over here. Run these seats backwards so people don't get confused. Any seat over here they can use.
On this.
Okay, he says he'll be here in 20 minutes. Is that 1919?
Sure.
Okay, he will go last, he said.
Yes.
Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Khalil will be here in, I should say, Dr. Muhammad should be here in about 19 minutes. They said to try to follow along with the live stream, so he will be the last one that we will ask the question. So, thank you all for coming out tonight. Let me first welcome you all and also acknowledge that we are living and moving and acting on stolen land, to acknowledge that. First, I would like to quickly read the mission of this SOMA Justice. Two organizations are hosting this SOMA Justice and SOMA Action Racial Justice Committee, who's kind of supporting SOMA Justice or working with them. So SOMA Justice's mission is to reimagine and center the conditions in which justice, survival, and joy flourish through community building, education, advocacy, and direct action. Through that, we challenge racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and other ideologies of power and oppression. And the mission of the SOMA Justice Racial Action, SOMA Action Racial Justice Committee is that we are committed to raising awareness and addressing the structural racism that persists at every level of American society. We run programs, events, and activities that seek to empower, inform, and motivate Black and brown people and their allies. At the local level, we work with grassroots groups, organizations, and activists to promote our common cause. I want to take a moment to thank Enterprise Solutions of New Jersey for their live streaming and all of the help and work that they have shared with us and that we work with them and arrangements that we do. Really appreciate all of your hard work. Thank you. Okay. Today, we have a very, very interesting topic and some wonderful, wonderful panelists. Tonight we're going to discuss the significance and importance of the Black vote. It is sought after by all varied political leaders, even Republicans, different factions, with nearly nothing tangible given in return. We are going to explore wielding the power of the African American vote, despite the fact that we are not a monolith. We're going to explore how this knowledge can be broadened to motivate other marginalized groups and their allies, and we can see how we're going to work together to support one another's causes. So I will start to introduce our panel. Okay, I'm going to introduce Khalil last. Hopefully you can be here. So Dr. Khadija Costley-White here. She is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Dr. White researches politics, social change, and identity in media, and is the author of The Branding of White Wing Activism. The news media and the Tea Party, the news media and the Tea Party, that's part of the title. Her writing and commentary have appeared in such publications as Vice, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Huffington Post, BBC, Washington Post, and numerous radio and TV interviews. I tell you, I have to really shorten these bios because if I read all of them, as much as they've accomplished, we'd be here about a half an hour at least, just telling their bios. Okay, Reverend Eric Dobson over here at the end here is a senior special advisor to the Fair Share Housing Center and the executive director for the United Black Agenda, where he advocates for racial equality, social justice, and economic empowerment. With a career dedicated to uplifting marginalized communities, Reverend Dobson has been instrumental in advancing fair housing policies and addressing systemic racism throughout New Jersey and beyond. Reverend Dobson's unique blend of faith-based leadership and public policy expertise has allowed him to build strong coalitions across civic, grassroots, and faith-based organizations. Our moderator, the lovely Mia White, is assistant professor of urban and environmental studies at the New School, where she teaches courses on race and space to students pursuing degrees in wide-ranging fields, including urban and environmental studies, design and urban ecologies, race, philosophy, and historical studies, as well as sustainability management. Mia regularly leads public teachings on critical race theory and critical environmental humanities, anti-racism, and reparative planning practices. Among other appointments, she has been appointed to the New Jersey Reparations Council's Environmental Justice Committee. Very impressive. And the last person, I think that committee is wonderful, so I don't mean to slight anybody else. The last person who is not here yet, but will be here, is Dr. Khalil Muhammad. He's the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that's why he's lately flown in from Boston, and his plane was 2 hours late. He directs the Institutional Anti-Racism Accountability Project and is the former director of the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division of the New York Public Library, and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. His writing and scholarship have been featured in national print and broadcast media outlets. He has appeared in a number of feature-length documentaries. So you guys are really, really lucky to have this wonderful panel to listen to today. I believe at this point, I'm going to turn everything over to our moderator, Dr. White.
Ms. Barbara. Give me a hand up. Barbara is the one that got us all together and helped organize this beautiful event. Thank you so much, Barbara. Greetings, everyone who's here and joining us via live stream, and welcome once again to tonight's special conversation on the power of the Black vote, a blueprint for progressives everywhere. But first, maybe because it's been a 10-day week for me already, and it's only Thursday, I'd like to invite us to take some deep and restorative breaths together for our collective nervous systems. I know that probably, like me, you are reading things in your social media and in your news media that are shocking and that are a lot for all of us to handle. So this is an opportunity, I think, for us to just have a brief shared moment of grounding, restorative silence for all that we might be carrying with us in this conversation. So I'm going to close my eyes for 5 beats. Feel free to join me, and thank you. Thank you very much. Very short, repeated version of what I do in class. And we do that for about 5 whole minutes, and it can be a little challenging for the students, but always an excellent, I think, experience. So, a brief reflection to get us started. As I referenced, the pages of our news and social media are rife with harm of many kinds, local and global. And we witness these realities on a daily basis as we wrestle with them over our entire lives, even as we try to build a beloved community here in South Orange, Maplewood, and elsewhere. It seems to me that a central question for us in this moment of ongoing and unfolding historical harm, in whatever electoral cycle it might be, is this: how do we resist pessimism that threatens to fragment us? And how do we create the conditions of abundance that all of us need, including space for more joy, more creativity, more safety, love, and possibility? These are the kinds of questions that sit in me as we gather here tonight, and that motivate my work, my research, and my teaching. Luckily, our guests here each labor with some aspect of those questions from their particular point of view and their various lanes. We were going to start with Dr. Muhammad, but since he will join us shortly, I'm going to turn to Dr. Costa-White.
That was not what I expected.
Since he's not here, you get to go. You get to go. So thank you so much, Dr. White, for your time this evening.
This is going to be fun, Dr. White.
Dr. White. You all can guess why we both have the same last name, right? So we have all witnessed the harm of so-called post-racial politics and the backlash to the presidency of Barack Obama. Into this recent history is Kamala Harris's historic run for president of the United States. We know that this moment is both exciting and fraught. So the question to you to get us started, what are your thoughts about the political and cultural terrain that a Black woman president will be stepping into? Not a big question, no. And it's just to get us started, and a sub question, because we have to be annoying as academics with our sub questions. What can you imagine we must do to prepare for what will be a future backlash to President Harris's administration that might be similar to the political, cultural, and social upheavals that we witnessed after the election of our first Black president?
Okay. That's
Really?
it's like the easiest question I've ever heard.
Okay. Should
I talk tonight? I can Hello?
It slips. Here, take this one.
Okay. Thank you. So first I just want to say thanks to SOMA Action for organizing, especially Barbara and Nick, and both of you for allowing me into making this happen and putting questions together and making the space available. So thank you, and SOMA Action for asking us to partner with you. So I speak as a professor who studies media and politics and social change, and I think about that stuff a lot. I also have done a lot of grassroots organizing, and some of you know me from some of that on the ground around racial justice, social justice issues locally. And so as I think about these questions, I'm thinking, I feel like from both perspectives, of, like as a scholar, but also as a person who is on the ground trying to figure out how we all can come together and make everyday life better for everybody around us. Okay, so the first thing that when I think about her jumping into this presidency, the first thing I thought about was obviously Obama is our last reference for at least a Black presidency, and he came in the midst of crisis. Not saying like Abraham Lincoln or FDR had it easy before, but he jumped into the fire with the greatest recession since the Great Depression, and I think what's fascinating to me is even though we look back, right now as we're in the midst of the backlash, right, over the Obama presidency, we forget when he was elected, we were in the streets. Were y'all in the streets? When Philly, we were running around high-fiving random white people and cheering. It was a moment in which we felt like there was a miracle. It was miraculous. America was something that we thought it wasn't, and there was this moment of possibility. And I kind of want to hold on to that in a way, because that is also, I think, what her potential presidency represents for a lot of people, is America being better than we think it could be, or it has been. And so there's that. There's this brightness of I always like to crumble everybody when I do my Tea Party talk, where I'm everybody's Obama will have a magical spell that will change race in America, right? But we had this feeling at least.
Yes.
And then I think Harris is also being brought in the midst of a crisis, but they're crises of silence. So it's a very different kind of thing, right? When it's like an ongoing pandemic that is killing, like still killing 1,000 people a week, we don't talk about it, right? Or when it's what most scholars in the world are calling an ongoing genocide that our tax scholars are going to, like, there's a silence around that. And so I wonder, you know, I do think, despite our silence, both of those things are going to occupy the presidency, actually. You know, they're saying so far, like, Social Security isn't seeing a huge swelling, at least people getting or receiving disability, but we are seeing, like, a huge percentage of people who are getting long COVID or disabled by it. So I think that those kinds of things will manifest, and also, like, even this week, this whole, like, now pagers are exploding and walkie-talkies are exploding. This kind of cyber terrorism thing, I think, is going to be a part of Harris's presidency, actually. And I can't imagine it staying isolated to the Middle East. I think a lot of times the things that we bring there have a way of traveling elsewhere. So I think that stuff is going to pop up. So I think one of the questions, and like, Barbara, you tell me, because I know I was like 5 minutes. So I want to make sure I don't go over it. Okay. One of the things that we've seen, so the question then is like, are we ready for a Black woman presidency? One of the things we've seen over the last decade is around the world, we've seen tons of, I shouldn't say tons, but we've seen women presidents in lots of places. India, Mexico, Ethiopia, Italy, Germany, like, you know, we've seen women leaders, South America, Peru, like, we've seen women leaders elected. We have a model now of what it really looks like. We've had it for, you know, years. I mean, go back to Margaret Thatcher, blah, blah, blah. So I think, and we, like, poll people generally, depending on how you ask the question, people generally say they're ready for a woman president. And when I say generally, I'm like, at least 51%, right? So it's not pushing us over, but the good news is, like, women tend to vote more, women support Harris more than men do. So, like, you know, I think the polls in general are leaning towards her. So, I mean, if you're talking about, like, electoral prospects, yeah, I could say America's ready for, like, anybody but Trump in certain ways, or at least a good number of people are. But I think for me, the question really is like, well, what does a Black woman presidency mean for us? Like, for us as Black people, for us as just people who are invested in this country. And that in certain ways brings me back to Gaza, for example. Like, Gaza in certain ways was a Black vote issue. Like 60% of Black Americans said they wanted aid conditioned based on whether or not Israel was holding up human rights and what they're doing in Gaza. And Harris has just said, no, I'm not doing that, right? So there's like a engagement there with Black voters and like what Black voters want. And I think about like Obama in certain ways when he was president. Y'all remember when there was like a kid who had come to the White House at one point and he was killed, or she was killed later on? And so Obama went to Chicago and he gave a speech. And part of that speech was like about Black parents and how they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So it's like, it's just like a crazy speech. Like, you don't go to a funeral and like, you know, talk bad about the people, somebody who just lost their daughter, for example, right? You don't talk about it. So we have to, so I'm really wrestling with what Harris has had to do in this, you know, people are going to tap to the center, this idea that her appealing. So she's like, I'll put a Republican in my cabinet. I don't care so much about fracking anymore. I don't support the Green New Deal. And so I think, you know, there's that. And part of it is because she's up against what this scholar, Brooklyn Gibson, calls weaponized misogyny, which is, like, misogyny was a term, no, not Brittany. I'll think of that. But she's at Northwestern. But she came up with it to really talk about the way that misogyny gets targeted towards Black women in particular. So y'all think about welfare policy, for example, the welfare queen. That is like a misogyny trope, right? Thank you, Moya Bailey. And so we see a lot of that mobilizing policy, and she's working against that in a certain way. And that is why she's performing as she is. So anyway, I'm wrestling with what her election will mean, not just for her, but also like when we have this kind of identity and we have this investment in this identity, what does it mean that we can get out of it? And what can she do in operating in that space? And Kalila's here, so.
Yes, perfect and perfectly timed. So we're going to transition to Dr. Muhammad. Thank you so much for your time this evening, sir.
You gotta hold 10 seconds.
Yes, okay. Thank you for rushing here in the context of a late plan. So the question to you is, we know that Black history is magnificent, it's global, it's a history that includes many striking chapters of resistance and uprising against racial oppression, including the long civil rights movement, which grounds our understanding of the beloved community of what we need to do. Can you speak about the historical impact of the civil rights movement on today's struggle for racial, economic, and environmental justice, and how this history might help us better understand our current political moment?
Sure, thank you. And apologies, 2.5-hour delay. So, unfortunately, I did teach today. So,
Yes.
and I have been listening, so I heard much of what everyone said just up until the last 5 minutes as I transitioned from a car to the space we're in. So it's an honor to be here with my friends and colleagues and people who are committed to this work. So thank you to SOMA Action as well as to SOMA Justice. With that being said, I think that there are a couple of key points I want to emphasize about the civil rights movement, and as Mia described, the long civil rights movement, which is a term historians have given to a much longer period of resistance that doesn't simply start with the Brown v. Board decision or with Rosa Parks' protest in Montgomery, but reflects a commitment to inequality that was grounded in the material conditions of Black life and suffering that come with the end of Reconstruction. And I think there are a couple of things I want to do with how to think about this historically and its relevance for political and progressive organizing today. One, to be very clear, I think we always have to remember that the work of social change is always a minority project, and not in the identity or ethnicity or racial sense of things, but in the small number of people who do the work. And that is not to say that communities did not rally and come together in defense of their own or rise to the call to action when placed upon them. But by and large, if we look across the historical archive for the work that Black people did, work that I like to say today, which I didn't always say, and I certainly wasn't trained to think of it this way, as pro-democracy movements. Because the infrastructure of fascism that we often associate with the period of the 30s in Europe, whether Italy or Germany, that infrastructure is already in place in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And no longer a headline for most people, and certainly not in this room, but the Germans went to great lengths to actually study what was happening in this country, just as the Afrikaners did when the National Party won a major election in 1912 and eventually formalized apartheid in 1948. So when we think about resistance movements, we have to think of them globally. We have to think of the circuits of knowledge that existed amongst a small group of people. One of the more interesting aspects of the early 20th century resistance movements is that they were far more heterogeneous in both the nationality of those who participated and in the very U.S. white-black binary, very racially diverse, which is to say that one of the greatest threats to capital and one of the greatest threats of solidarity and working-class mobilization occurs in the 1870s and 1880s amongst agrarian workers. Some were landowners and farmers, others were farm laborers. A kind of populist movement that represented an interracial solidarity movement that did pose a real threat to the southern gentry and capitalist elites. Many of us know what that looks like in terms of the stories of labor struggle and strife over railroads and monopoly power that give us the formal period we call the Progressive Era in the early 20th century. So why do I give this big frame? Because if we are thinking about a blueprint today, we have to remember that the pressure to use racism as a wedge to divide and conquer these groups is not just a story that exists in the Trump era in the way that we think about it. And it's not just an old story that we might know of the difference between indentured servants and enslaved people. But in fact, it is an ongoing, shape-shifting reality because the consummate threat of white people choosing allyship or choosing common cause with black people is what this is really all about. The sheer dominance over black people is one problem, and the ability of black people to resist amidst the sheer terror or violence is another thing. But the propaganda that exists, the power of fascism, is really a power directed to a majority population of white people in this country that have always held the people power capable of overturning the system.
Yes.
And this is a fight for their hearts and minds. Now, why does that matter? Because the civil rights movement packaged its resistance in the tropes of American exceptionalism and constitutionalism as a rhetorical strategy to compel white people to see their history as on the line. If you believed in your own country, you have to side with us. That came with it great moral power and urgency, but it also came at a significant cost. Because in the legislative victories of that moment that we celebrate annually, particularly with the SOMA March, which drives me crazy these days because the last 10 of them have been in the midst of a massive retrenchment and state violence against black people, and yet we still go to SOMA as if what we're commemorating still reflects the reality that we had when the Voting Rights Act itself has been gutted. That's another conversation. So this trade-off in rooting the civil rights movement in a kind of story of a community who deserved their citizenship on the very terms that the nation promised them, and that the nation set on paper, there's a famous King line, be true to what you put on paper. Left us in the wake of those legislative victories with a very narrow understanding of how to measure success after that moment. And that narrow understanding was not necessarily a uniform understanding within the movement itself amongst the many constituents who had fought to varying degrees for both legislative victory, but for something even more expansive about a different kind of America, an America of true equality and egalitarianism, an America that recognized that a lot of this is old tropes, but that people, it was as much important to be able to buy a hamburger at a lunch counter than it was to sit at a lunch counter. This is sort of one of the ways. But the economic roots of the populist threat of the late 19th century, and what I didn't mention, the more popular front socialist threat of the 1930s, which brought FDR into a sharper focus. If I'm going to save capitalism, I'm going to have to socialize our economy.
Yes.
Johnson did the same with Medicaid and Medicare. That threat that was generated by the power of white Americans to tell America, through the perspective of black people, this is not the country we want to live in any longer, was more or less a project that was crushed both in the federal government attack on the Black Power movement, which emerges after the Civil Rights movement, but also in the ideology of individualism that emerges in the wake of the Civil Rights movement, that translates progressive possibility into personal responsibility as the currency of what a post-civil rights America was really all about. And as a consequence, I would say, and I'll stop here, go into other, but this is the big takeaway, that these resistance movements were always small to begin with. But if we imagine that the civil rights movement had solved what progressives imagined a different America could look like, it did anything but. It ended up reinforcing that you could paint a vision of a multiracial America by airbrushing black people into it on the very terms of which they had been excluded. Only now you would have black faces in high places standing in to represent this vision of a multiracial America. Not progressive in any way, shape, or form. And indeed, the insidiousness and the deliberateness with which Nixon himself adopted an idea that we can actually save the system as it is by using an old colonial process, which is to take the indigenous, pick off some small portion of them, empower them, give them, back in the colonial period of the transatlantic slave trade, you give people titles as chief, give them stools to sit on to make them powerful, cover them in jewelry, and all of a sudden they do all the work of controlling the natives that the colonizer no longer has to do. And it sounds cynical, but actually that's how it works. So we have to keep in mind that this tactic worked in the post-civil rights era. A lot of black people showed up in places for the first time only to represent a party of one. Only to be the first and the last who sat in that position. Maybe a second and a third at some point. But that wasn't the intended goal. And also, as James Baldwin often would say, that the price of the ticket was full assimilation to destroy your identity, your sense of self. And, I'm using a lot of glib language here in the interest of efficiency, but basically, when you're sitting at the table and someone hands you the menu, and your people are on it, you don't get to change the menu. Or you don't get invited back to the party. So we are struggling with the Obama era, in my opinion, representing the culmination of this strategy that took place after the 1960s. And we will never agree on how conscious Obama himself was of this. But I will tell you, as someone who at least is trying to pay close attention to Obama, when I listened to, I did listen to it, but when I read, which was an audible book, his biography, the first installment of his autobiography, Obama makes it plainly clear that there's nothing that we're having a conversation about tonight that he doesn't know, but he chooses to fundamentally believe that the American project, as he understands its history, is perfectly sound. That it does not need reworking. It just needs to live up to its potential. And there are many people who believe that it cannot work on its potential because its potential was subsidized by the lives of people whose bodies and whose land were the fuel to create the thing in the first place. And this might sound abstract, and maybe we can end this conversation down the road with a progressive blueprint that recognizes that fundamental tension. But that in and of itself would be progress, because we're not even teaching that fundamental tension. All right, I'll stop.
Thank you.
That was perfect.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Reverend Eric Dodson, thank you so much for your time. We heard the word blueprint, we heard a lot. I know there's a lot in your mind, especially in the meetings that you just came out of earlier today. You are president of the United Black Agenda, which is focused on eliminating the racial wealth gap and repairing past and current harms to black communities. No small goal. But these are key narratives that we think about and wrestle with all the time. They feel very central to this moment and to the history that Dr. Muhammad just outlined for us. Can you tell us a little bit about the vision embedded in that language and how they connect to the needs and desires of the black voters as you are seeing right now?
Well, let me first of all, thank you so much for putting this together, and my colleagues on the panel. Just extraordinary information. And every time I hear blueprint, I think about Jason, so about blueprint. But it's interesting to me because we're at a space in New Jersey that has this huge racial wealth gap, right? But also, I think New Jersey has probably one of the most intelligent black voting population in the country. Do you know New Jersey ranks in the top 5 in black voter turnout? Yeah, New Jersey ranks top 5 in black voter turnout. In fact, to Dr. Khalil Muhammad's point, we have some folks who've been picked off, but in fact, you cannot win a statewide election if you don't have black support in New Jersey. Murphy had 94% of the black vote when he won his first election. His second election, which was even closer, he had an even higher percentage of the black So what does that tell us? In New Jersey, if you can get black support, you will win the statewide election because the European American vote is always split. So he bucks the 50-year trend. Think about it. Murphy bucks the 50-year trend because New Jersey, you know, we're national elections, we are a blue state. Statewide elections, we're a purple state. We elect a Republican governor, then a Democratic governor, then a Republican governor, then a Democrat. But Murphy was able to buck the 50-year trend because he appealed to black folks and great masses, right? And so that shows me that New Jersey has tremendous amount of power amongst its black people if we ever come together, right? And coalesce around a candidate that we support. Now, I'll tell you this, and I'll get you to the United Black Agenda. I think we're intellectually smart enough to know, and we talk about why black people, you know, our numbers are still low in terms of compared to the white folks, but why black people, we don't fall for the okie doke, and for the most part of us. If we're not inspired by a candidate, we're not going to vote. Right? That's just like Obama inspired us. Right? Yes, we can. Right? And I believe right now Kamala is inspiring us, and we'll see what happens. But the numbers don't lie. New Jersey's in the top 5 when it comes to black voter turnout. And why is that? We need to unpack that. And this is why the United Black Agenda came about. Right? We are a coalition of 10 of the leading black civil rights organizations in the state of New Jersey. And we recognize the fact that when Murphy was running the first time, the need for us to come together with collective power to get some significant legislation passed and not just come to the new governor one by one, organization by organization. Does that make sense? So we are all 10 independent organizations, but we are a collective organization, a 501c3. So if you want to donate, you can go to the tax code. We're a 501c3 that comes together to get legislation passed and build that collective black voting power because we understand New Jersey has a need to deal with the economic racial disparities in this state, but also understand that the power, if we ever come together, we can get significant. Let me give you examples. Of course, New Jersey, the median household income among European Americans is like 300-something thousand in New Jersey, and the black population, African Americans, are like 17, a little over 17,000. So there's a huge racial wealth gap, and that we are addressing each and every day through affordable housing as we advocate for New Jersey's Monroe Doctrine and codifying the current system. We just passed a huge, tremendous law that will help speed up the production of affordable housing in New Jersey, which we're about 200,000 units behind, right? We just got, with the help of the United Black Agenda, we've gotten over the last 2 budgets close to maybe $60 to $70 million in the budget for first-generation homeownership. Let me repeat that. First-generation homeowners, because first-time homeowners, there were other folks that qualified. And we want to get down to the census tract of folks whose parents had never owned a home, who've been, stripped because of racial segregation and racist housing policies. So we're seeing the numbers of African Americans homeownership getting, the numbers are going up because we advocated for over $50 million in this pilot program. We want to continue to do that. We also, through the leadership of, we come together, whoever is the expert in a particular field. So that's how the United Black Agenda works. So that the Institute for Social Justice led the charge with the United Black Agenda to get 83,000 folks on probation and parole the right to vote in New Jersey. Right? So these are the things that we're working on. Reverend Boyer, Salvation for Social Justice, I was just on a call where we are organizing black clergy around the state around voter turnout, and the work that Reverend Boyer is doing around maternal infant health, what he's doing around reshaping community hubs for policing, dealing with that issue. So we come together to really try to impact the lives of African Americans and make sure they're not just surviving, but thriving around policy, around issues of policy that impact our communities tremendously. And I say this like, many of us don't, maybe some of us don't realize, I think 95% of our lives are impacted by policy. Yeah. And so when we look at policy, and not just let me be clear, is not just about getting a civil rights bill passed or a policy passed. If it ain't in the budget, it ain't gonna work. So we are also advocating for the resources behind it. One of the things that we did in the United Black Agenda through Fair Share Housing Center was the Fair Chance in Housing Act. This is one of the strongest statewide laws in the country that limits the use of criminal background check for folks applying for a house apartment. Because they were going back 20 years, going criminal background check for 20 years. New Jersey has the strongest statewide law on limiting the use of criminal background checks. And what we cleverly did was ask to staff up the Department of the Division of Civil Rights. They put it in the budget, they hired staff, and Assemblyman Benjamin Wong just talked about the number of cases that are open that the DCA, the Division of Civil Rights, are going after and prosecuting these landlords that abuse the law. So United Black Agenda is focused on making sure Black communities thrive and not just survive. And we're doing it through policy, coming together by collective power, understanding the history of our foremothers and forefathers who taught us that collective power, as Dr. King called it, constructed alliances. Now, we're a 501c3, but we have independent autonomy. But that constructed alliances around our desire to really address New Jersey's huge racial disparity. And we know the historical implications of New Jersey being the last northern state to end slavery, all the policing issues that are going around in New Jersey. So it's important. We see the need to address the racial wealth gap and the economics around New Jersey being one of the wealthiest states in the nation, one of the most diverse states in the nation, but also one of the most segregated. And it's interesting to me, and I'll stop here, when I think about history and opportunity. And I say, this is just my opinion, I think LBJ was the last president. Well, actually, I think he was the greatest president for civil rights, because before LBJ, if you count the legislation, there were 8 pieces of civil rights legislation leading up to LBJ. 8 pieces of civil rights legislation in this country. He passed 4 of the 8. In one term. Think about that for a moment. 4 of the 8 was passed under LBJ's, and to Dr. Muhammad's point, the Great Society Initiative was the last time we had a serious conversation about poverty. We haven't had that conversation since 1968. And what he was trying to do in the Great Society Initiative, and what I think about what the United Black Agenda is trying to do, is to build these coalitions to bring about change, to try to shift, our country from, Dr. King said, the rich get socialism, the poor get capitalism. And think about that for a moment, right? Dr. King wasn't assassinated because he was trying to integrate lunch counters. That's not why. His Beyond Vietnam speech, when he was talking about reshaping America's economic situation, is what got him assassinated. So when he came out publicly and opposed the war in Vietnam, he talked about shifting the economic platform of America to a more just, equitable society. He gave that speech April 4th, 1967. April 4th, 1967, King gave that speech. He was assassinated April 4th, 1968, 1 year later. They wouldn't bothering King when he was talking about integrated lunch counters. When you talk about reshaping America's economic system, that's what got him assassinated. So when we think about looking at here, particularly in New Jersey, how we reshape the economic system in New Jersey, it's going to cost. It's going to cost for us to really reimagine what we can do in New Jersey. With a voting population of African Americans who has one of the highest turnouts in the country. That's power. UVA recognized the power. Now, there are a lot of situations, the preachers always say, this is my last point. Keep going. This is my last point. The UVA recognized that power and recognized there were some issues that really harnessed that power or didn't allow that power to be released, and that was that was because of what we call in New Jersey the party line. Now that party line is no more. And before they can create that, we really need to coalesce around getting African Americans together about building a real powerful voting bloc that has significant change for our communities.
Thank you so much. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask each of you wonderful people a question and ask that you answer it as briefly as possible, which I understand the challenge to this. And then we're going to hopefully have a conversation with our beautiful audience. So, Dr. White.
Yes, Dr. White.
Hi, Dr. White. We do this. Okay, so here's my question to you. Yes, I know it's not showing my question. Okay. Activist scholars who write about class. So, not everybody wants to change the economic system okay. Activist scholars who write about class and the black voter are often concerned that black liberals and white leftists are willing to leave behind the most economically vulnerable in our communities. What do you think about this? Do you think it's true that we vote against our best interests?
I'm really sitting with all of this, right? I've been struggling, right? Because Adams, right, in New York, you see what's happening there.
Yes.
There's black mayoral leadership. We're watching in Philly as the black mayor there is destroying Chinatown for development. I came here, I was arrested in Philly when the mayor there was trying to pass a law that banned sharing food with homeless people. And so I was outside trying to figure out how my friends could get into the meeting, because of course he's also a black mayor, Mayor Nutter, whose DA ended up going to prison. And he put this meeting in the smallest possible room he could find, and then brought a bunch of cops to stand outside the front door to intimidate everybody who was trying to go in to help homeless people. And to my surprise, when I went back to Jersey, Ras Baraka was trying to pass the same ban in Newark. And nobody was doing anything, actually. So I was like, what is happening in Jersey? Because at least in Philly, we were going to the meeting, I was going to jail, like things were happening. And here, it was just silence. So I have a ton of pessimism I'm grappling with around black leadership and what happens when you put black people in these spaces, especially in black cities. And what happens to the people in them, right? Like, Adams in his first month was like cutting food you give to children, and he was like forcing them to eat. He said he was vegan, and then he wasn't vegan, but he was taking meat from the children, and then housing was terrible. There was a huge fire, and it turned out his friend, who was also a shady developer, was running housing there. So fortunately, his house of cards is falling down right now, which is very good in terms of what's happening around policing and cops running after children and threatening them with guns. I'm grappling with all this. So anyway, I would just say very shortly in terms of like thinking about poverty, to me, I do keep coming back to poverty. I come back to the fact that Kamala Harris, I have yet to hear her say poverty in a speech. Now, I'm sure she has. I just have not heard it. I Googled it today, could not find it. The policies I've heard her talk about, economic policies, a lot of them seem to be about development and housing, or child tax credits, which actually don't really help the most vulnerable because of how little money they make. And so I'm struggling, I guess, at that point about what that means.
Thank you. So, Dr. Muhammad, how do we wield the power that Reverend Dobson spoke about? What are the stumbling blocks that explain what Dr. White is outlining, what she is grappling with? What is happening such that we don't have a structural assessment of racial capitalism, and we just keep venerating individuals, and we just then are stunned that we see the house of cards fall down again and again and again?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is that we have a very poorly educated population in general, across the board. White people, black people, the only people who are well educated in this country are H-1B visa immigrants. I mean, literally, people who have received excellent educations in their home countries, and then by virtue of that excellent education, get to come here and by the luck of the lottery ticket, live their American dream. So education is a huge stumbling block, and let me be more precise. Political education is at the cornerstone of a populace that understands what the values of democratic participation in governance look like, and how to judge the merits of policies that would benefit or harm them. And we just do a bad job. So there's a million data points to make this point. I'll just mention a couple simple ones, which is that we know for a fact how badly Americans are taught civics in general. We are watching in real time how legislative activity is designed specifically to limit or censor knowledge about American history across multiple field subjects, axes, you name it. Which is the proof in the pudding that how children are socialized in a democracy, as the earliest Enlightenment philosophers imagined a functioning democracy would work, is at the cornerstone of what kind of democracy you actually get. One that creates a marketplace of ideas where people have, as economists might say, perfect knowledge, right? Our economic system is built on a model that if everyone has transparency to the value of goods and services, then the price will be the optimal price because people will choose what they're paying for. Of course, in the real world, people don't have perfect knowledge. So that is the answer to your question, the very short answer. To be more precise and maybe connect to what Khadija just described, I mean, it's outrageous what's happened in New York. But we have to remember that Eric Adams won in a ranked choice voter election where clearly he had the majority support. He was the first preference of people who we might call working class black New Yorkers and brown New Yorkers. He was their guy. And the question we could ask ourselves is, how is it possible that a former cop who had continued to run on a law and order mandate could be elected in the wake of everything that's happened in that city, but for the fact that New York City has always been a place where even for working class people who are the most vulnerable to community violence have been told that the only way out of this is more and better policing. That is not a progressive message, and indeed many progressive organizations have fought against that messaging, but it has been a hard road to travel.
Yes,
So there is really no pathway to the kind of collective action that would rally around progressive values for low-income black voters, but for some form of organized political education. And I'll close, at least with this question, with the alternative, which is working brilliantly. The alternative is the mobilization of low-income and poorly educated white Americans who are being taught propaganda and how to mobilize that propaganda in the form of voter participation at every level of our political economy, from school board elections to county clerks to state registrars and county clerks, and you name it. Now, much of what they're being taught and what they're being mobilized to do is false information and misinformation. But that is the point. It works. If you engage people at a fundamental level about the importance of how the system works and what they need to know, they will be motivated to invest and engage in the system. And the thing to me, probably the greatest tragedy, I didn't know, Reverend Dobson, that the black turnout was so high in New Jersey. The question I would ask, really quickly to finish this point, is it true at all levels of voter participation, or was it only true in the quadrennial presidential race?
Presidential elections.
Correct.
Yeah.
So this is where we are losing, and we will continue to lose over and over again. If black voters are only showing up or overperforming every 4 years for a presidential race, for an office that actually has the least power to determine the fate of the lives of most people, then it is a fool's gesture, by and large.
Thank you. Last question, and then we're going to open it up. How do we address this fool's errand, this every 4 years? What does the United Black Agenda want to think through as a blueprint for marginalized groups and their allies as a mean to fight this constant cycle?
Yeah, to clarify what I said earlier, yes, it is going to presidential elections. The midterms aren't that high at all. I just want to say, I know this is about, to your point, Dr. Muhammad, I believe that we have challenges in the Black community, and there are historical challenges around how we've been assimilated in this country. But I would argue that it is European Americans and white folks that fall for the okey doke because their problem, white poverty in this country is astronomical. And they still fight to make sure they stay poor because they vote against their interests every year in midterms and presidential. Like if you look at the data, who white Americans support, I mean, this guy coming up, he cares nothing about them. White poverty. There are more white folks on welfare than there's black folks, but they consistently vote against their interests. Consistently support a party who cares nothing about them. At least our folks will fight. We may, fall for, some of us been picked off and fall, but at least we never stop fighting. That's the untold story about African Americans in this country. We've been fighting since they brought us to the shores. We've been fighting. Our folks fight to tell this country to live up to that principles. Now they picked a lot of us off, but I got to tell you, I am hopeful because what we're trying to do, and I think to answer your question is really, and to your point, Dr. White, is really try to educate our folks in the importance of midterm elections and the importance of policy, because we've been sold a bill of goods and we've been disappointed so much because then they're like, you know what? I'm not going to vote because no one's inspiring me. No one cares. You can look at it one way. You can look at it one way and say, black people don't come out to vote because they're not educated. Or you can look at black people don't come out to vote because that's not a candidate that's inspiring them, that's speaking to them. There's two ways to look at it. And I choose to look at it like, give us somebody that we can be inspired by. We'll support them. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Black folk, we're very welcome and we'll trust you until you burn us. I just think, what we're trying to do is like the call tonight before I got here. These black institutions that once was the backbone of our community, trying to reinvigorate black clergy around policy, right? Educate black clergy around policy. Our black institutions, that's why United Black Agenda came together with the leading civil rights groups in the state of New Jersey to really shape policy, right? And it takes time. It takes time for policy to be implemented and for housing laws to take place. We're short 200,000 units because of the politics in New Jersey and governors and Council of Affordable Housing just stalling delay the building and construction of affordable housing. It takes time for these new policies to be implemented and take shape. But I do think that the blueprint or getting back to what's not new, United Black Agenda is not new about bringing black leadership together. It's what our forefathers and foremothers had done. We're just trying to re-engage that and really go back to do what, when you think about Dr. King's work, they had to be trained and prepared for civil rights. I mean, they were, you weren't just going to be, walking out there and someone spitting in your face and you not retaliating. That didn't happen. Try that today and see that. There's a lot of training and tutelage and thinking about the concept of the philosophy of nonviolence, right? So we have to really go back to the philosophy of how do we understand the philosophy around economics, around social conditions why you have to vote. You know, I think about Dr. Howard Thurman and his book, Jesus and Disinherited, and he talks about why, blacks, some black folks felt no need to vote. What for? Nothing's going to change, Howard Thurman was a genius, and I think about, how do we get people to understand who Howard Thurman was, right? Before Dr. King, right? How do we get folks to understand who J.A. Rogers was, who wrote about sex and race and his whole concept, his myth about race? How do we, Ivan Van Sortela, who taught at Rutgers, like getting our folks to understand that we have a history of fighters. How do we get our folks to understand that the propaganda that we see on television? Like, do you know there was a black emperor in Rome? You guys know that? Rome was a diverse society. We don't talk about, like, this is a ton of stuff I gotta stop.
Yeah. But to push back, and I know I'm not supposed to because I'm the moderator, I love every single thing you're saying, but there's a third way to think about this too, which is it's easy to then make this black people's fault.
Exactly.
If Trump, if it can become, well, black people didn't do this, and black people didn't do that, and black people weren't enough of it, it turns into black people's fault. So for me, I go back to what happened to the Rainbow Coalition. What happened to, so this broader need and demand for broader political education that includes white people.
Absolutely.
White people, sorry, I
But that's
did
why
a moderator's.
But that's why I started with saying that New Jersey,
Yeah.
but to your point, New Jersey in the presidential is in the top 5 in black vote, because we don't fit, like Ibram X. Kendi said, the only thing wrong with black people is thinking something wrong with black people, right? And we've been socialized in this country to believe that, right?
Yes.
Even black people themselves.
I like going back to the history of the Klan in Jersey and white people beating up the Klan when they showed up in certain places, and the kind of unity of labor and how that helped mobilize. So when you talk about the 1920s and what happens in the 30s, you're also talking about this fracturing of whiteness that allowed and opened up a space for some of that kind of transracial mobilizing.
Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of statistics very briefly, and then I hope that we're going to get some questions from you all, okay? Just last week, the NAACP released its findings of a poll targeting 14.5 million black voters across 12 priority states where the black community holds significant electoral power. The headlines. Most, in other words, 78% of black voters polled are feeling the same or more excited than when President Obama first ran, with more than half, 56%, being more excited now than in 2008. This just came out 6 days ago.
Or half of the children.
Well, okay, let's second bullet. Over half of black voters say the highest priority for our elected leaders should be protecting our rights and freedoms. 53% said that. Compared to addressing economic concerns, 40% said that, and addressing other issues, 7%. Third headline. Economic concerns related to inflation are the most frequently cited unaided priorities for our elected leaders to address, again, according to this NAACP poll that came out last week, with essentials of daily life, including the cost of food and groceries and gas, housing and utilities, being the biggest economic stressors polled by these 14.5 million black voters across 12 priority states. So, do you all agree with these findings? What are your thoughts about this political moment, and what questions do you have for our brilliant panelists? Who would like to ask our first question? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Varela. Serve as the Executive Director for the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. We're a statewide C3 that does civic education, policy education, and voter education rooted in racial justice. I actually have a question for Dr. White. One of the things that I sometimes wrestle when we look at progressive spaces is who is leading the policy conversation amongst progressives. I think sometimes, and I had experience in Philly, so I can sometimes see this dichotomy where if you were to create a Venn diagram as to what white progressives and black progressives wants, that middle circle is kind of empty. Because while we may all use the label of progressive, when we actually prioritize what people actually need in that moment, it doesn't always feel like this intersection, right? And the Philadelphia mayor's election is a perfect example, right? But at the same time, you brought up the point of in New York, and the black and brown, maybe low-income, middle-income families. I guess one of the things I wrestle with, especially when we think about expanding the vote and bringing more folks into this kind of progressive space, how, like, is it a situation that we honor their agency to maybe vote for Adams because they truly believe that's in their interest? Or do we, or do we really think about how do we, I guess, educate / help them really understand, like, the bigger implications of voting for Adams and using your example, because I know many folks would say that Adams hasn't been great, and I would agree. But if many of these individuals are voting in their interests, how do we honor that? I go back to Philadelphia with Sherrod Parker. While Helen again may have been seen. So I guess I'm just trying to wrestle what's some of the strategies to kind of have this conversation, because you did have a lot of black individuals that did side with Sherrod Parker, despite one could say many of the policies that were proposed by Helen Ginn could be in their best interest.
Yeah, I'm okay. So yes, black people have agency, right? Yes, black people should vote the way that they think, but I think part of the question goes back to what Will was saying around like political education and the importance of political education. So my politicization in part in Philly came during Occupy, right? And I was out at Occupy, probably because it was like on my way from home and I rode my bike a lot. And so I would just stop by the camp like, what are these people up to? And then I was like, this is crazy. They have a library and they have free yoga and they're giving out meals and homeless people are coming up and getting free checkups and medical attendance. Like, and this is all volunteer. And it was like, I mean, people laugh at me sometimes, even Occupy people, because I still have this nostalgia, but part of it was like this possibility and people like acting out of faith and creating this space. And so I say all that to say that was a really fruitful moment because you saw black people and white people and anarchists and like, everybody was coming together and saying, what is the thing that we aspire to? What is it that's bringing us to this moment? And what can we make that looks better than now? And so out of that, like, Krasner becomes the yay out of Occupy, right? He was my lawyer, he was everybody's lawyer. When we were getting arrested, like, the whole what's going on in the district attorney's office with restorative justice, all of that is coming out of this, like, little moment of tent city, a bunch of, like, grad students and undergrads and high school students who came together and said, what can do with homeless people. Right? I mean, that was part of the radicalization of Occupy, was that we were sleeping on the street with people who did not have homes. And when the cops came and said, we're going to take all of your tents, they came to us and said, where do our things go? Right? It was the first time that they had a safe space where people weren't taking their things every day. And so, I don't know, I feel like, this is like when Don Mitchell, who's a cultural geographer, writes on public space. Public space is really incredibly important. Like, part of, I'm having like this person going at like the public pool locally. People will put pool on my grave when I die. But part of that is about like the importance of public spaces actually, and what happens in public spaces. I know this is like modernity and like the promise of the city and all that stuff, and all of that gets torn up in certain ways. But I do really believe in it. So part of I think happens is like being politicized, but also having spaces where that can happen. And so what, to me, Adams also represents the co-optation of the church, the black church, and like the existing institutions. All these people who are showing up to places and laying hands on them and stuff like that. Like that is to me about subverting like the radical potential of black institutions. And I think part of what we have to do is like undo some of that. And that has to do with that existing hierarchy there too.
More questions? Thank you. Ms. Don? Hi.
Hello everyone, my name is Venkat Bala. I'm an here accidentally, and I was honored to be in your presence. But as an immigrant, I have a different third-party view on how things were. And thanks to the Civil Rights Bill, there was also an Immigration Act that followed this received rights. That was the main beneficiary. And also our current contestant, who's Vice President Harris, she's from my hometown as well, in India. And Martin Luther King went to India in 1959 to study about the civil rights movement. And my grandfather worked for Voice of America back then, setting up microwave towers and radio towers to suppress or to be an alternative for Soviet disinformation that came in. My question is also alumni of Rutgers University. Paul Robson came and he went to California. And then you always have that art that precedes life. There was movies like King Kong, others that follow through. But if not for the Olympic Games too, which I would call it as a Black Power Games, where the US medal tally is way lagging behind in swimming and others as compared to the other countries. And then all of a sudden you have the athletics come as track and field, and then it zooms past all of that. But why is it that the voting as well as the treatment, whether it was like Kerry Garner or whether in Minnesota, where it is front and in the center and visible as a third party coming as an immigrant, it's very jarring for us to see this, how they're being treated as second-class citizens. How is it that we could collectively help and give back to the community that would encourage us? Because whether it is tech entrepreneurs or in the farmer side of things, as well as in the education perspective, how do we contribute back and give back to the community that has given so much for us in Invest as well? It's such a short span. Thank you.
I really appreciate the personal connection to much of what we talked about. So I teach students that are policy students, and about 56% of our current Masters of Public Policy students are international students. And the largest sub-demographic within that are people who we would identify as Asian, either South Asian or East Asian. Some of them have been here a long time, meaning they've been born, in this case as international students, they would have been born elsewhere, but they've been here a long time. So I mention this because if I were to create an archive of the students' papers, I ask my students to write an autobiography every semester. If I were to create an archive and show you how many students, parents as immigrants, articulate to them some version of anti-Black racism. Don't be like them, don't socialize with them, don't fall into a community where you're too close to them. And this is not just for South Asian or Asian immigrant children, this is also for Black immigrant children. So this is anecdotal from the perspective of a sample of, at this point, hundreds of students that I've taught almost over a decade. Now, that being said, there's also a small minority of students who articulate, this is what my parents have told me, but this is my experience, and these are my politics. So what I'm answering, the way I'm answering your question is to say that the same problem exists in the immigrant community as the problem I'm concerned about the miseducation of the largest demographic in this country of low-income people. That we live in a very stratified society, and so most people are low-income, period. With the notable exception of a class of immigrants who are filtered into this country for precisely the reason that we don't have to pay to educate immigrants, and then we can somewhat underpay them for their work, and then we can kick them out if we don't like the way they behave. And so it's a win-win-win in terms of our policies. The solution to this, of course, would be that we would create communities of knowledge and political education. And that's already happening, but we can do it with much greater urgency and with much more intentionality, and not in the reactionary way in which organizations like Asians for Black Lives emerged in the wake of what happened to Michael Brown and others with Sandra Bland during that period. We do have the agency and possibility for educating immigrants about precisely the way that they've been used as a cultural wedge. I'll just finish on this point. The role of model minorities, of which Asians are overrepresented in this country, to reject the political demands of native-born Blacks and Hispanics or Latinos by and large, has been going on for 50 or 60 years. The problem is that not only is it accelerating in this moment, but it is extending to increasing numbers of Black people who are now standing in as, we don't call them model minorities, but both the obvious in terms of the overrepresentation of Nigerians on elite college campuses, but also native-born African Americans. Obama is a model minority. Whenever someone pointed to Obama as the exception that proved that America was not a racist country or did not have structural racism, Obama was being positioned as a model minority. And he himself often leaned into and reinforced this problem. So the people need to understand the way the model minority myth cuts against efforts to mobilize against policies that are harmful to the majority of people who are not benefiting from a system that is not meant to provide an adequate economic floor and social safety net for low-income people.
Can I say something real quickly? In addition to what Dr. Muhammad said, I think that there's a serious problem broadly with education. So what we don't have here in the United States is also lacking in a lot of other places, right? So, I had an Asian student who's an international East Asian student. I teach at the New School. During COVID, I ended up on a Zoom with this person, and they were ranting and angry and really trying to redirect their own anti-Black racism because they had been pushed down some stairs at Union Square. And so I found myself as a Black Korean person speaking to this person because they were really trying to understand their feelings. One of the things that this young lady said to me was, why do you all keep calling me Asian? I'm not, and so anyway, we got into this conversation where, when you're she's Korean, in Korea, you don't call yourself Asian. This is a very uniquely Western American point of view that she did not know was going to happen to her when she came here, because her education is not transnational. It is not based in decolonization or a history of empire and the transatlantic slave trade. She's not getting that education. And then here, we are certainly not getting that education. Maybe you're getting when you're in college, if you have a couple of professors that you bump into, but so I would just say that there is a problem. It is a global problem where we are not studying each other. There is no mutual study of each other, such that this young lady is coming here and she's like, why are you calling me Asian? Right? And I understand that, she's 19 years old, but we have a global problem.
I would say, that's one of the things that I try, I'm out to dismantle the concept of race. Like, part of the challenge in America that many white people think they're white, and they have no idea of the national. I was on when COVID happened, it was like, okay, let's do an icebreaker. If you could speak a second language, what would it be? And everybody went around and asked, what's English? Yeah, and they would be Spanish, German. They said, Reverend Dawson, what do you say? I would like to speak my native language, but I don't know what that is. And that was the reaction I got. Like, So I went home proud that I did that, right? And I said, oh shit. Half of them don't know what can't speak their native language. Because I hadn't even thought about And that's why we struggle to have this conversation to connect on a human level, because some of us think we're white. And that's why poor white people vote against their interests just as more so than poor black people. Because they've been sold, and listen to Dr. King's speech. He gave them Jim Crow, and they ate Jim Crow. As long as they worked for pennies and they ate Jim Crow. But what they had was their whiteness. That's what America has done to us. Not just black people, but all of us. Baldwin said when an Italian guy comes over here and becomes a guy named Joe, then he's lose all sense of who you are. And that's what I'm trying to get people to understand. Like the humanity of us, of all of us human beings. Yes, our culture matters. Yes, our ethnic group matters. And when we lose a sense of that, that's why we're easily fooled to be racist, sexist, because we don't have no clue who we are.
Any other
Question right here.
Actually wasn't the next good question, but that actually does meet with me. One thing that always seems to irk me is this second-class citizen, mentality that we have as black people here in the U.S. and in the diaspora as well. And I want to say, right, of course, that's my question, but I want to say that that's what I feel holds us back, because we feel that we will never be as good as the white person or as good as our oppressors. And I'm wondering if you can answer this question, or anyone can actually answer this question, if this is why black people are really only voting every 4 years when there's a president running, or when there's somebody running for president, because it's that aspiration, and we still fail to see the power of the grassroots.
I was trying to listen to your juxtaposition here. It's aspiration versus what?
When it comes to the every 4 years, those running, we're looking at like this big picture instead of seeing the power of the grassroots have, seeing the power of organizations like this, seeing the power of local politics. It's kind of like an identity issue. Yeah.
I'll say it's sad. I mean, so there's a kind of crass take on this. Take it for what it's worth. I mean, the Democratic Party in this state and in many places does not encourage wide-scale participation in local races, because they rig the system to position the people they want as a series of favors and trades and earned privileges. And so it's not like they're running around saying, we want people to participate in democracy. The easiest way for all of you to get involved is to either convince someone who would be really good at doing something because they are good at it and their values are ones that would promote transparency in government and good governance in general, or do it yourself. But if someone is already in line for the next local office, which is the stepping stone to the slightly bigger local office, which is the stepping stone to the other bigger office, we are captured by a Democratic Party that is actually not that interested in mass participation in these local races. So I can accept a certain amount of white people's ice is colder than ours problem, which is internalized racism, and it's certainly a problem. But I think, more practically speaking, part of the demobilization of people at the grassroots level serves a party establishment that is not that interested in that until they show up and knock on your door and say, it's time for you to get out and vote. And then you're like, oh, okay. I will say, I was publicly on the radio calling for Joe Biden's resignation within hours of that debate performance. And it was shocking to me not just that party elites were lying to all of our faces, that not only was he okay, but including AOC, but that this was the best way forward. I mean, like, let's just go back 2 months, because that's what was happening. But on Facebook and in my social media, where I was saying this to people like you and my friends, most of them were pushing back. No, we shouldn't do this, no. So, like, when does it stop? Because if we allow ourselves to continue to take our marching orders from the Democratic Party elite, who are constantly droning on about how they got this, and how they have figured it out and they know better. I mean, Quentin Fulks said for 2 years that the polls didn't matter. That as Trump was gearing up to run for re-election, and all the polls were showing Biden was going to lose, the black head of the campaign party, whatever, I'm losing my words, it's been a long day. Person campaign strategist for Joe Biden was saying, we shouldn't listen to the polls. Jim Clyburn was saying on Meet the Press, oh, remember when they counted Obama out back in 2008? We proved them wrong. I was like, oh, really? But now do the polls count?
Yeah.
Of course they do. So this is what I mean about political education. Like, local machine politicians, all the way up the line to elite party Democrats, don't always have our best interests in mind. They have the interests of the party in mind. Sometimes the party interests align, sometimes they don't. Are their party interests, even when they don't align, a gazillion times better than the other party's party interests? Right now, yes. Not always true, but certainly right now, yes.
Okay, so the thing that's in front of me on my paper is that there are 40 million Americans living in poverty right now. It's about 12% of the population. That, and the word, again, I said that earlier, the word poverty has not come up in this election very much. That stands out to me in terms of this question of democracy and who we expect to get activated and who we expect to not be activated when these elections roll around. But I was like, I'm glad you said that from the bird's eye view, because I feel like I came out of Philly and I came to Jersey and I was like, I want to see what's up with these suburbs. You know, I'm gonna get active a little bit. And I'm gonna talk about race and talk about, like, let's just do some transformative stuff. And yeah, there's a wall in terms of organizing. There's a wall in terms of like who people, you know, who they think they should be pleasing. You know, who, you know, and I thought that a lot of this was national politics, like these dynamics of what constituents you really should care about, or what constituents you really should be serving. But that happens on a local level as well, and it happens repeatedly over and over again. Whose interests get put ahead of other interests, whose voices get put ahead of other voices. So, I don't know, that's what's standing out to me, which is just like, well, where do you start, right? I mean, like, you can be, and like, to me, I'm like, SOMA has this thing where they have this like rabble-rousing black person every every 8 years they roll through. It's so like maybe that's been my thing, and I'm gonna retire and somebody else will pick up. But I think part of that is this kind of, because the co-optation also happens. So someone was telling me about, you know, something that happened in the late 90s with a black kid who was accused of stealing, who was accused of intruding into the middle school because he went back to see a teacher. They press charges, and there's this whole thing, right? And a local black politician was part of the people going after this child. And so, like, I keep trying to figure out how do you even intervene in the local level. And part of my, again, pessimism has to do with, like, if I can't even help with the school board, or if I can't even help with the, you know, with the mayor's, like, it's all volunteers, you know, like what is the entryway here in terms of trying to get people politicized? Try to get white people politicized, right? Because they care when, like, there's like pussycats and Trump is in the White House, but I feel like the politicization like suddenly disappears when they have a more familiar kind of person in power. So anyway, that's some of the stuff I'm wrestling with.
And you can't ignore the economics of it, right? So the economics of to run for office costs, right? So it takes money to run for a position. And both machines know that, and they utilize that. That's how they pick people on. You know, I'm gonna be get you elected. You can run on my ticket, right? But now you owe them, right? So that, I mean, that's the politics. Hopefully with the line being down in New Jersey, there's a window of opportunity for folks to organize, and this is what United Black Agenda.
We need to come together.
Yeah,
I think that's part of it. Is the progressive groups
Yeah,
in the
that's-
state actually have to build together so that we can have more of a voice because we get picked off too.
Yeah, and that's we have a C3 and a C4
Yeah.
because that's where the money speaks, and so we need to raise the resources and have collective mindset around what we want to achieve, and really have an opportunity. This small window of New Jersey to reshape the policy of New Jersey is here, and so history matters. Whenever there are significant things that happen, it's always timing. Either the timing was we took advantage of the timing, or we didn't. And I always come back to what if there was a second Johnson administration and the war ended? What would the Great Society look like if we had a second term when we had? Go back and look at, that's the last time we talked about poverty. Go back and look at the Great Society initiative where we got Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, the endowment of the arts, all these things that we enjoy today that we think about that help stave off some of the issues of poverty. Go back and look at it. The HUD was the office was intended to create integrated communities throughout America. That's what HUD was. Guess who the first HUD secretary was? George Romney. Mitt Romney's dad. And he was actually doing it. And Nixon got a hold of it and fired him. So this is what, history, and I believe, I'll stop talking like that. I believe once Johnson realized that he lost King's support, it was done. Because I'm not running again.
I have a question. What brings with Dr. White mentioned the Rainbow Coalition, and then I think it was Khadija mentioning us having to get together, work together, and unify. One of the things that really bothers me is that I believe that at the very core of the Republican policies and their activities and everything that they're doing is aimed at resistance to what they call drowning of America. So back in the 2050s, 2040s, and things like that. I think that is basically what they're doing, attacking immigrants, attempting to make people of color and people doing all of the things that they're trying to do in Project 2025. Now, since America is drowning, how do we come together with common goals against what is happening with the conservatives and to fight against their attempt to maintain the power of white males in this country? How do people of color, how do people who are marginalized and their allies come together to take our power back, to resist what they're attempting to do in this country?
I'll take a stab at it. The browning of America, that entire narrative, it's simple scapegoating. So while America may be browning, white people are suffering and don't realize it and are staring at the flag of America is browning. So my answer to your question is we have to meet people's needs. And the way that we meet people's needs is we have to be way more radical with our economic policies. We have to decommodify quite a lot to meet people's needs. So for me, this idea that your wealth accumulation primarily occurs through your home ownership fundamentally means that black people, let's talk about black people because we're black and we care about black people in this conversation, black people will never catch up, period. If wealth accumulation primarily occurs through home ownership, it's a wrap because it's too late. So the problem is we cannot accept this level of economic discussion. We cannot accept the idea that we may need to completely overhaul how we understand, for instance, housing. For instance, the idea that everyone needs a place to be, a place to live. That it's not just if you're a professor at Harvard, Rutgers, or the New School, or you're a fancy scholar, reverend, combo person, that you have a place to live, right? So this is the challenge. One of the things that Dr. Muhammad and I are overlapping with, he's overseeing the New Jersey Reparations Council. I sit on the Environmental Justice Committee of the council that he is overseeing. And one of the things that we are talking about in the context of reparations is how we have a fulsome and capacious conversation about how we meet people's needs. Now, some people are like, give me my little $10,000 check. The issue is, it would be about that if you're trying to count everybody. And the problem with that is, number one, it feels really good, like that ice cream sundae, you shouldn't really have, and then later you're bloated and you feel terrible. It's not gonna last. What we need is change that will last, because the harm that's been done is intergenerational. So when we're ready to have that decommodification conversation, I'm ready to have that conversation. That's a very hard conversation.
I totally agree. I don't think Republicans resist the drowning of America. That's just a tool to exploit. America exploits. That's what it's about. It's about exploiting the government had to step in. I don't know if he ever got it, but Elon Musk was going to cash out $56 billion. It's like the 1%, and I'm not, America's about exploiting that class of people. Is about making sure blacks, white, whatever you want to call yourself, are exploited to its highest degree, and they invented race to do it. Because that people went to the $40 million and did a seat to go to the wealth at that level. They're interested in keeping their wealth and keeping exploiting us. So race, class, all this stuff is just tools to do that. That's all it is. And unfortunately, that exploitation started with human chattel when they bring our ancestors over and they had free labor. And they built the wealth of the world off of free labor. So they could give, they want to give that up. So we had to outlaw and say, okay, we'll give them Jim Crow. And a lot of white people say they're white, and they'll blame black people, say black people lazy, and some of the hardest working people in the world are.
So I'm going to do something we don't often do. I'm going to offer some constructive suggestions for how we move forward. And that is that let's just say that President Kamala Harris wins, or Vice President Kamala Harris wins. And in her unique multiracial identity, as was true with the opportunity with Obama, but an opportunity that did not be fully realized, let's call her a second of a kind, not a first. Right? If we lean into her first, then we're going to give her a pass. But if we embrace her secondness, that we've been here before, then we should build local communities of political clubs and organizations that hold everybody, top to bottom, accountable for the mobilization that won her that seat. And that, just like we've seen these Zoom phenomena, I think Oprah's doing one tonight, right?
Yes.
But the Irish had one, the black women had one, the brothers had one, the rich white guys had one. To me, the possibilities here are that these are embryonic manifestations of the possibility of people being organized on day one of her presidency, such that they can begin to be mobilized at every level of the political system to make real the possibilities of what her symbolism suggests. Because if we don't do something differently, if we don't take the energy that has yet again been mobilized to elect her, just as was true with the energy that was mobilized then we will squander yet again our people power. And our people power at the local level is the very people power where the Democrats are like, we got to get people to the polls. I have been in more than enough closed-door conversations with party elites and other influential people. I won't name any names, but trust me, people who were at the top. I'll just name one, Valerie Jarrett, in the room. And the complaint in the conversation from grassroots organizers is like, you guys keep asking us to get people out to vote for various Democratic elites. At the time, it was the guy running in Alabama, Roy, what was his name? Roy Moore, who won a rare Senate seat as a Democrat in Alabama at the time. And then you pay overwhelmingly white political consultants to tell you how to do this. They get paid, six-figure salaries, and black people come out and do what they're told, and then everybody goes home and they show up 4 years later, or midterm, or 2 years later for a presidential race. That's a definition of insanity. So now we have an opportunity to say, we love you, Kamala. You represent the global South in all of its beauty and glory. We are so grateful for your sacrifice, but now we're going to hold you accountable from the most local level. And unlike Obama, who literally told black people, I got this, and took great umbrage and exception to Black Lives Matter activists making demands on him as if he was somehow responsible. Like, why am I responsible for a policy agenda that would address the systemic inequalities that exist in this? We cannot do the same thing again. So we can unify around a commitment to building political organizations that will hold the Democratic Party, or will build independent parties that won't end up with lunatics like Robert Kennedy, but will actually build a base of people. And we may not field a candidate that can run for Senate, but we can build independent candidates who begin to learn the policy apparatus of our communities. And over time, we are much stronger in this work.
Thank you. So we're doing closing comments now.
I'm done with mine.
That was fantastic.
I knew it was coming.
That was so good. Okay, exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to say that, so I'm a media scholar. One of the things that people like are stories. Like stories. That's how we understand our world, how we understand ourselves, how we understand where we come from. Narrative, right? So one of the things that I think is the tension here is like what representation means. Like symbolically, it means internally. When people see a black woman becoming president, there's something there, and I think that's at odds with like actual policy and what happens on the ground. So I guess part of what I would say, my takeaway from this is like watch the stories you're being told. Listen for who is centered in those stories, who gets to speak, who does not get to speak. And that's like in the news you consume, but that's also in the presidential speeches you're delivered, or the kind of rhetoric that comes down the pipe. So that's like my takeaway and how to move forward. I help run SOMA Justice, which is a local group that is trying to do progressive organizing on the ground in South Orange and Maplewood that is multiracial and that battles ableism and transphobia. And so like there's a lot of enemies too, because there are people who are ableist and people who are transphobic and people who are homophobic. So I guess part of what I'm going to say the takeaway is to plug in. If it's not SOMA Justice, it can be SOMA Actions for Racial Justice. It can be the United Black Agenda. Like it can be whatever it is that's working us and pushing us towards equity, towards a space where my kid and your kid gets to run free and think free and be free in all sorts of ways and not hungry. And I think, let me see if there's anything else. And the last thing I guess I have to say as a coming out of a communication and information school is when we talk about misinformation, but watch for stories that just confirm your biases too. Those often are like emotionally charged. Again, just ask questions of information that you're getting and in that circulating around you and try to really question it and create new stories that center vulnerable people and thing that you're asking when you're listening for a Harris speech. You're asking, well, where's the vulnerable person in this speech? And where's the vulnerable people in the ground speeches that we hear on the local level at our flag raisings and potlucks?
Very, very briefly, I don't know if Kamala Harris will win. I hope she wins given what our options are. But whether or not you're focused on electoral politics, we are in a bubble here. It's an incredible bubble. I'm from Queens. I'm not from a bubble. And my issue is that I think that we're so much in a bubble and trying to organize in our bubble, we are not understanding the wild privilege that each of us probably in this room has. And so we're not really serving or supporting or enabling the people who are struggling at the most basic level. Sorry, that's been telling me he loves me. I'm supposed to set a 9 Sorry, Andrew, he's probably watching. Anyway, who are you serving? Do you know the people who are struggling in South Orange and South Orange Maplewood? Do you know who they are, and are you serving them? And if you don't, then you can't be surprised that they feel jaded or they feel disbelieving in wanting to engage in any type of electoral politics, whether it's local, state, or federal, because they have been forgotten. So there's this nasty cycle that happens where we are disrespecting people by living in a 2, 3, 4 block radius, knowing that they're suffering and acting like we don't know. So I guess what I would say is everything that these brilliant two over here, this was about to speak, said, but also serve the people in your community, and you will then build connections that might lead somewhere valuable in terms of an electoral landscape.
I don't have much to add to. I think you all said it best. I would just use this word creativity and imagination. My brother had said that art imitates life, and it wasn't until my son became a Broadway actor that I realized that art actually dictates life. And when you think about it, like the stuff that we're seeing today, we see movies and TV, about this stuff. Like, I don't know if you ever saw iRobot. And we're seeing this stuff now. So actually art dictates life. And what it's really actually doing is the creativity, the imagination of artists. We all are creators. We all are artists. So let's imagine and create a world how we want it to be. One of my favorite plays that my son was in on Broadway is Hades Town. He just flew back from Japan. He did a production of Rent in Japan. Back in Queens. He just got back in Queens.
You tell me.
Hades Town was one of my favorite shows he was in on Broadway. And it says this line that has stuck with me that I just can't get out of my head. The boy was a muse, he was a genius. He chose to live in the world as it could be in spite of the way it is. That just makes me tear up when I just think about what are the possibilities if we choose to live in the world as it could be, in spite of the way it is, imagining and being creative and thinking about what are the ways we can unify, what are the ways we can have conversations about race and economics to bring us together, to change the way we live in this country. That's it.
That's it. Thank you for coming.
Good night, Tony. This was a great panel. Aren't you glad you came? Okay, thank you so much for coming, and I hope to have more of these, and thank you especially for all of you went through to get here.